This video goes over the concepts of necessary and sufficient. So necessary and sufficient are math terms, but they're also just regular English words. And if you understand what the words mean themselves, you'll have a good idea of what the math terms mean as well. So a necessary statement is one that must happen for a conclusion to happen. So it's necessary. You have to have it. And a sufficient statement is enough on its own to guarantee that a conclusion happens. So it's sufficient. It's good enough. And necessary and sufficient are their own claims. So you're claiming that one statement is necessary for another statement or sufficient for another statement. But those things are also statements on their own that you're relating. So as an example, you could say, you must try hard to succeed, so trying hard is necessary for success. Or you could say, if you try hard, you will succeed, so it's a guarantee. So you're saying trying hard is sufficient for success. So those are examples of necessary and sufficient statements. Now it's important to understand that necessary and sufficient are related, but they aren't the same thing and they don't have to go together. So necessary means that you have to have it, but it may not be enough on its own. And sufficient means that it's good enough by itself, but there could be other options as well. It's not necessarily necessary. But you can have something that is necessary and sufficient. It's just not guaranteed. Like one doesn't guarantee the other. And people will often get things wrong by assuming that necessary means sufficient or sufficient means necessary. So to use our example of trying hard and succeeding, if you say that you must try hard to succeed, so you're saying trying hard is necessary, you're not saying trying hard is sufficient. You could still try hard and not succeed. You're just saying if you don't try hard, you're guaranteed to not succeed. But you could still try hard and not succeed. That's what necessary means. It's not necessarily sufficient, it's just necessary. And then for the sufficient case, if you say, if you try hard, you will succeed, so it's sufficient to try hard, well, you could still succeed in other ways. You're not saying that you have to try hard to succeed. You're just saying if you do try hard, you'll guaranteed succeed. But you could find other ways to succeed as well without trying hard. So just because something is necessary doesn't mean it's sufficient, and just because something is sufficient doesn't mean that it's necessary. So how would you go about proving something like this? If you wanted to prove that something is necessary, so A is necessary for B, well, what's really important is that you have to think from the ways that you could be wrong. So if you look at this table at the bottom, there's only one case where it's wrong. So if A is false but B is true, so A doesn't happen but B does happen, then in that case the statement is false because A is not necessary for B. B was able to occur even without A. So that's the one case where the statement could be false. But if A is true, no matter what happens with B, the statement, it's always going to be consistent with the statement. And if B is false, no matter what happens with A, it will always be consistent with the statement. The statement can never be proven wrong. So you don't want to test cases where you know A is true, and you don't want to test cases where you know B is false, because no matter what the outcome is, it's always consistent with the necessary statement. So it doesn't provide any support for the statement, even though it's consistent. It's completely irrelevant. It's, to use an example that's not within necessary and sufficient, it would be like saying all girls like dolls or something like that, and then testing boys and showing that boys don't like dolls. Well, no matter what the result is of your test on boys, it's completely irrelevant because your statement was about girls. So no matter what the result is, it has no relevance and it doesn't do anything to improve your confidence in the statement. So that same thing happens here, where if you test cases where you know A is true, it's completely irrelevant and it doesn't provide any support. And if you test cases where you know B is false, that as well has no relevance to the statement you're trying to test. So you want to test the times when A doesn't occur, when A is false, or the times when B does occur, B is true. And you do have to use some kind of rule or pattern to show that um, it's not possible for anything to end up in that red box ever for any possible case. So to use a more tangible example, let's go back to the statement of you must try hard to succeed. So trying hard is necessary for success. So you can think of all the people who don't try hard, and then if any of those people succeeded, the statement is now proven false because you have your counterexample. So again, it's easy to prove something false with just a single counterexample. But if none of them succeeded, well, your statement is more likely to be true, but it's not a guarantee yet. And then you can also think of all the people who succeed, and then if any of them didn't try hard, well, your statement is proven false with a single counterexample. But if all of them did try hard, your statement is more likely to be true. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to search people who you know tried hard, because no matter what happens, it's always going to be consistent with the theory. It provides no support. And you don't want to search over the people who you know failed, because no matter what happens, it's always consistent with the theory and it provides no support. And if you're thinking about it, um, not in math logic, you might say, well, if you look at a bunch of people who fell and they all didn't try hard, doesn't that support the idea that it's necessary to try hard to succeed? And that's actually true, but for the opposite reason. So the reason why it supports the theory is because you've found people who didn't try hard and they didn't end up in the red box. They failed. So it supports the theory, but it's because you found people who didn't try hard and they failed. But if you're just searching people who you know failed already, no matter what happens, no matter what the result is on whether or not they tried hard, it doesn't have any relevance. But knowing that people who failed didn't try hard does support the theory, because you you have people who didn't try hard and they failed, not because you had people who failed and they didn't try hard. So it's a bit complicated and difficult to understand, but what you want to look at is all the people in this specific example, is all the people who didn't try hard or all the people who succeeded. And then it's worth noting that you also have to consider all the possibilities that haven't occurred yet. So even if nothing exists in the red box currently, well, your statement is actually that nothing can ever exist there. So even if nothing is there right now, something could end up there in the future. So if you want to really prove your statement to be true, you have to show that no matter what happens, even in cases that haven't occurred yet, nothing could ever exist in that red box case where you don't try hard but still succeed. And proving sufficient is pretty similar to necessary. So if you say A is sufficient for B, well, again, you have to think of the ways where it could be wrong. And the difference is that sufficient is wrong in a different case. So if A is true and B is false, then that means A wasn't actually sufficient for B because B didn't happen. So that's the one way it could be wrong. So in the sufficient case, so you can look at all the cases where A is true or where B is false and test those. But again, you wouldn't want to test all the cases where B is true, guaranteed, or A is false, guaranteed, because no matter what happens, it will always be consistent with the theory. And it's just like testing if you say all girls like dolls and you test boys. Well, it's completely irrelevant. It doesn't provide any support for the theory, and it doesn't have any chance to disprove the theory either. So it's the wrong thing to test. So to go back to the real world example, if you try hard, you will succeed is our sufficient statement. Trying hard is sufficient for success. So you can think of all the people who try hard, and if any of them failed, it wasn't sufficient. So you know it's false. Or you can think of all the people who failed, and if any of them tried hard, then again, trying hard wasn't sufficient, and your sufficient statement is false. But if none of that happens, then it's more likely to be true. And again, you have to know, you don't want to search over the people who you know didn't try hard or who you know succeeded, because it doesn't support the statement. And you can have both at the same time, like I said before. So something can be necessary and sufficient, and that means that they'll always both occur together. So if trying hard is necessary and sufficient for success, then you always succeed if you try hard. You never succeed if you don't try hard. If you succeeded, you know you tried hard, and if you didn't succeed, you know you didn't try hard. They're like one and the same thing if something is necessary and sufficient at the same time. And I've color coded the statements, so anything that's blue you know is true because it was necessary, and anything that's red you know is true because it was sufficient. So for some more real world examples of necessary and sufficient statements, you could say, you'll lose if you use a certain strategy. So that means using a certain strategy is sufficient to losing. So if you use that strategy, you know you're going to lose. Or not using that strategy is necessary to succeeding or winning. You know you have to not use that strategy if you want to win. So necessary and sufficient statements can be inverted to be like to one and the one or the other. So in some ways, every necessary statement is also a sufficient statement, and every sufficient statement is also a necessary statement. And so another example would be, if you don't have money, you won't be happy. So having money is necessary to being happy, or not having money is sufficient to not being happy. Or you could say, you have to eat a certain thing to be healthy. So eating a certain thing is necessary to being healthy. Or if you exercise, you'll guaranteed be healthy. So exercise is sufficient to being healthy. Now, if you're really sharp, you might notice something in the last two statements. So if you look at them together, they actually can't both be true at the same time. So both of those statements can't be true because you can find a case that can't satisfy both. So if you don't eat a certain thing, excuse me, if you don't eat the certain thing, but you do exercise, well, because you didn't eat the certain thing, you should be guaranteed to not be healthy because that certain thing was necessary. But because you exercise, you should be guaranteed to be healthy because it's sufficient. But you can't be both at the same time, so both statements can't be true. So having a good understanding of necessary and sufficient can help you see these kinds of contradictions and understand, okay, what's actually necessary, what's actually sufficient, and how confident can I be that one is true or not true. And for some final things to remember, I think the big one is that necessary and sufficient are two separate things. So, as I keep saying, you can have something that's necessary, but it's not sufficient on its own. And you can have something that's sufficient, but it's not actually necessary. And to use that same example, hard work being necessary does not mean that it's sufficient. It does not mean that it's enough on its own. It just means you have to have it. And hard work being sufficient does not mean that it's necessary. It may guarantee that you succeed, but there may be other ways to succeed as well. And then the other big point is that you have to support the idea by showing that it can't be wrong. So you have to think about the ways that it could be wrong, and you only want to test the points that have a chance to show that it's wrong. And if you're using points that are guaranteed to be consistent, you're providing no support for the statement at all. So that's the end of this whole necessary and sufficient section.